You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Harry Truman has this weird event when the governor of the state of Missouri, his state, comes up to him and says, "You know, Harry, I would never run against you." "I knew Stark was going to run against me," Harry S. Truman says, the moment he told me he would. It's a story that you don't hear too much about. We almost never had Truman in politics.
Hey, it's Paris. You know, I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
Truman's political life was on the edge. The machine that had built his career, as we said, the Pendergast organization, was gone. Tom Pendergast, the boss, had once called Truman "my boy Harry." That doesn't mean that Harry Truman agreed with him all the time. But he had gone to prison for income tax evasion in 1938, and anything associated with him was now somewhat toxic in the state of Missouri. Lloyd Stark was the reformist governor who had once quietly sought Pendergast's backing. And now he positioned himself as a corruption fighter. And that Stark would replace Harry Truman for the Senate spot in Missouri seemed like the most insignificant thing in the world. Not anything that would affect the American history or anything like that. In fact, here's how David McCullough describes what was going on. In its issue of April 24th, 1939, Life magazine devoted 6 pages to the meteoric rise of Governor Lloyd C. Stark. An article illustrated with numerous lurid photographs of the Pendergast debacle. Stark, said the magazine, was the new Democratic version of young Thomas E. Dewey, the Republican racketbuster of New York, and claimed that the major result of Pendergast's fall was to catapult honest, efficient Lloyd Stark, an apple grower, right into the presidential ring, or at least to a seat in the United States Senate. In Missouri, praise for Stark was overflowing. He was called Missouri's moral leader, a figure of national importance, a presidential possibility, and in any event, a man with a future. He has earned the high estimate, wrote the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, in an editorial that Stark himself clips and sends to Franklin Roosevelt, a one-man PR agency. He chose the hard way, the Dispatch writes, and of course the right way of meeting all the obligations of his office. He could have chosen the easiest way. He might have gone through the routine, perfunctory, basked in the approval of the all-powerful Pendergast machine that had supported him for the nomination, acquiesced in the boss's few but salient demands, and kept the peace. The governor entered his office under the shadow of the Kansas City machine. He had to live down the suspicion of being such a man. The contrast to the path chosen by Senator Truman went without saying. Now, you have to remember that Life magazine, Time magazine, especially at this time, is going to trend a little in the Republican direction. Not so much like a isolationist or bitter type parts of that Republican Party. It was also a very internationalist Republican view. Read Dewey, read Vanderburg, things like that. Life acknowledged that Stark had accepted support from the same people that Truman had, but stressed there was nothing new in American politics about a governor turning on the machine that helped elect him. Theodore Roosevelt had done it, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt too. All 3 became president. And square-shouldered, poker-faced, dignified Lloyd Stark, too, would like to be president, quite definitively. Truman told newspapers, "If Stark runs against me, I'll beat the hell out of him." It's mostly bluff, though. Even he didn't think it really had much of a chance. Franklin Roosevelt didn't want to get involved in this race. At this time, he did not know Truman that well. He led Truman to think that he was on his side. Truman had gone to the White House about some pending legislation in the president insisted that, Stark was funny, and I don't think your governor's a real liberal, Roosevelt says. He has no sense of humor. He has an ego. But Roosevelt gave no endorsement or no encouragement to Truman. Stark saw an opening, and it's not surprising, because really, without this machine, Truman didn't appear to have much support on his own. And Stark saw an opening to cleanse the party and take Truman's Senate seat for himself. There was a little bump on the road for Stark in that Maurice Milligan, the U.S. attorney who had actually prosecuted Pendergast, decided he'd run as well. So there were 3 Democrats in the primary of 1940, but just 1 seat. Truman, almost written off, takes to the roads. He shakes hands in farm towns. He talks about roads. He talks about war veterans. He leaned on his World War I record, and he stayed loyal to voters, to his record, even to the disgraced former political machine. Truman, ignored by most power brokers, worked the towns. In the 1920s and 1930s, Tom Pendergast ran Kansas City's Democratic machine, one of the most powerful political operations in the country. It controlled jobs, contracts, and elections in Jackson County, Missouri, often through blatant vote fraud and patronage. Politicians who wanted to get ahead in western Missouri usually had to deal with the organization, and Truman was no exception. He was a World War I captain. His haberdasher business had failed. He entered politics in 1922. He wins a local judgeship, which at this time was kind of a name for a county commissioner. In Jackson County, he has the support of the machine. He builds a reputation for honesty and efficiency. Although his haberdashery business had failed, people did respect him. He manages budgets, he manages infrastructure, he manages roads. There were no scandals during his management. He wasn't flashy, but Truman was known as reliable. In 1934, Pendergast needs a U.S. Senate candidate. His first choice is either decline or get vetoed by all the factions. Pendergast wasn't a sole dictator in his machine group. There were a number of factions. Truman was far enough inside the machine to be trusted, but far enough outside to seem clean enough. He was the compromise pick. Still, people in Missouri and in the Senate joked that Truman was the senator from Pendergast. But Truman didn't act like a puppet. In Washington, he voted independently, and he focused on practical issues like transportation and veterans, and slowly earned respect. He never took a dime in graft. There's no evidence he was involved in any of the machine's criminal activity. When Pendergast was indicted, it looked like curtains for him. Many people said that he should disavow Pendergast, as Stark did. But Truman said, "He was always my friend, and I won't deny him now." Here's McAuliffe again. As predicted, Stark tore into Truman at first chance, calling him a Pendergast lackey, a rubber-stamped senator, and a fraud. The decent, honest, God-fearing, law-abiding citizens of Missouri know him for what he is, a fraudulent United States senator, elected by ghost votes, whose entire record in public office has been devoted to one purpose alone, the service of a corrupt master. In Truman's files was still the letter from Stark thanking him for the introduction to Tom Pendergast. Learning of this, several on the campaign staff urged Harry to release it, certain it would settle the outcome. But Truman refused. It was on his record that he ran on, and tirelessly throughout July he crisscrossed the state in his own car, a '38 Dodge. When Harry drove, he drove fast. Too fast, the others thought. His speeches were without charm. He made no attempt at eloquence. Moving among country crowds, pumping hands, he would say, "I just wanted to come down and show you that I don't have horns, and I don't have a tail, just because I'm from Jackson County." That's the Kansas City area. He also took a stand on civil rights. "I believe in the brotherhood of men. Not merely the brotherhood of white men, but the brotherhood of all men before the law. If any class or race can be permanently set apart from, or pushed down below the rest, so may any other class or race, when it shall incur the displeasure of its more powerful associates." As the campaign goes on, one thing that's being noticed is that some people don't like Stark that much. And for instance, it gets out that his chauffeur was required to salute him like a military salute. Then, you have to remember this campaign's happening at the same time the National Democratic Convention's meeting to give Franklin Roosevelt a third term. And he makes what's kind of a mistake.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso Virtuo Coffee Machines. Ready to enjoy the bold flavors of barista-quality Nespresso iced coffee at home? Simply fill a glass with ice and press the brew button on your Virtuo Pop machine to enjoy rich double espressos roasted to stand up even when chilled. Refreshingly bold iced coffee. Refreshingly easy to make at home. Visit Nespresso.com to shop now.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there's one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at Friskies.com or visit your local store.
He announces himself for the vice presidential nomination. And the other senator, Bennett Clark, who's serving alongside Truman but doesn't like Truman very much. This kind of supports him. And the St. Louis Dispatch doesn't like this very much. And they say, Lloyd's ambitions seem to be like the gentle dew that falls from heaven and covers up everything high or low. He's the first man in the history of the United States who has ever tried to run for president, vice president, secretary of the Navy, secretary of war, governor general of the Philippines, ambassador to England, and United States senator all at once and at the same time. I understand, too, that he's receiving favorable mention as the Emir of Afghanistan. That's a joke. So, now, to be fair, a lot of this is things that he's putting his name in for. He doesn't know which one is going to be available he's going to get. But we get it. It was a little bit too much, especially when in Chicago, Stark passes out bushels of apples and wound up with 200 votes on the first ballot. This gets out and is seen as a little bit opportunist. Days before the August 6th election, a letter went out to supporters. Be active. Be vigilant. Our chief danger is overconfidence. Beware of the friend who tells you it's in the bag. Stark is as good as nominated. Your help is not needed. Don't listen to them. Remember, one vote in the ballot box is worth a dozen on the street corner. It would turn out Stark's fears would be justified. On primary night, Stark leads by 11,000 votes, and Truman goes to bed expecting to lose. But as final returns come in from Kansas City and the African-American precincts where Truman had campaigned, Stark had barely showed up. The Pendergast machine had a better reputation than just as this evil political machine. The tide had turned. The final count was Truman, 268,000 votes. Stark, 260. Milligan, 127,000. He wins by 11,000 votes. It was the split and the anti-Truman vote that had saved him. Outright, these two competitors would have beaten him if they had united. In fact, the final total will be 8,133 votes that he wins by, thanks to a fractured opposition. Bess Truman reportedly hung up the phone on a 3 a.m. call from a staffer who said Truman had won, thinking it was a prank. Truman would never forget the primary from Stark. I hope some good fact finder will make a record of that campaign. It will be history someday. And he was right. As for Stark, his political career ended that night. He returned to his apple orchards. He never ran for office again, and he eventually became a Republican, supported Republicans like Thomas Dewey, who lost to Truman in 1948. The two men, once rivals, died just months apart in 1972, but Truman had nothing to do with them again. That SOB, he once wrote, I don't give a damn what he did or intended to do. He would later call the day he won the primary with Stark the happiest day of his life. On the president's death, December 26, 1972, a Missouri congressman, William Hungate, had a fitting tribute to Truman. showing how unusual the man was from what we may know today. Someone is alleged to have run up to Mr. Truman when he was running for Senate and said, "I bet you don't know who I am." To which Mr. Truman said, "No, and I don't give a damn." Well, said Hungate, at least a lot of us wish we had that kind of courage, but few of us could be elected doing that, except a man like Harry Truman. We don't know how history would have been different. Stark actually wanted to be, as governor of Missouri, wanted to be nominated as FDR's running mate. So maybe he would have been a contender in 1944. Who knows? One thing that's different, and we don't know if Stark would have done the same, is that Truman led the Truman Committee, which was regarded very highly for looking at contractors during World War II. Not a topic that gets a lot of attention, but a lot of people made a lot of money. A lot of millionaires were made during World War II producing all of that stuff of war. And some of it, of course, it had to be produced. It had to happen. There was almost no way to avoid it. The Truman Committee was one of the few parts of Congress looking at this. They held hundreds of hearings. They subpoenaed generals, industrialists, contractors, uncovered fraud, waste, mismanagement, investigated major defense contractors like North American Aviation, Curtiss-Wright, and others, saved taxpayers an estimated $10 to $15 billion, and did so without much grandstanding. It was a revolution, small in size, but important politically. A strike for liberty, struggle for principle. In the pale light, December 3rd, 1854, smoke from early fires curled above the Ballarat diggings. Inside, the rough wooden barricade of what was called the Eureka Stockade. A few weary miners, armed with whatever they had, pistols, rifles, even pikes, stood at watch. Most of the garrison, no more than 120 men, were sleeping. They've spent the night in revelry, nervous preparation, or quiet resolve. The stockade is little more than a makeshift fort. It's a rectangle of timber stakes and wagons hastily thrown together. It's not made to endure a siege, but they know what's coming. And they see it, sure enough. Movement. Orders shouted. A glint of redcoats among the trees, and then a shot. So I wanted to acknowledge Joe F. on my Patreon site in regards to the Concord and Lexington What You May Not Know episode. It is 250 years from these events, and I reran my episode, one that I really enjoyed doing, going over the events of that very important day. Joe F. is from Australia, and he writes, "I hope your international audience is growing. I'd hate to be the only one who doesn't even know what you're referring to, Concord and Lexington. I suppose it's a bit like saying we all know about the Eureka Stockade, but..." Thank you, Joe. And my apologies. Yes, my history, computer politics has always been a bit U.S. focused. We're going on 19 years now. Haven't changed that too much. It's an area of expertise. And since we talk about U.S. politics, the tenets, the antecedents is a better way to say it, are from, works better if you talk about U.S. history. Because if we talk about what happened in Britain or China too much, then people will just say, well, we're a different country. Even though I myself believe that there's a lot of good precedent internationally. But yeah, okay, so let's talk about it, because this is a formative event in Australian history. I will do my best. Historians dispute who fired first. Doesn't that sound familiar to Americans, right? A little like Lexington, right? But at that moment, the rebellion was no longer symbolic. Government troops, nearly 300 strong and accompanied by police, returned fire and began advancing in tight formation. Bugles rang out. Smoke thickened, and inside the fort, the defenders scrambled to return fire. some kneeling behind overturned carts, others shouting as they ran to man the barricade. Peter Layler, the rebel commander, tried to rally his men, but a musket ball shatters his arm. And yet, for 10 defiant minutes, the miners hold their ground till their ammunition is running low, and the redcoat soldiers charge with bayonets. Chaos follows. Shouts, blood, prisoners taken. The Eureka flag, a blue flag with stark white cross, was seized by a constable who climbed the pole just before it snapped in two. When the smoke clears, the rebellion's over. Dozens of miners lay dead or dying. 3 soldiers are also dead, and more are wounded. The stockade has fallen. But its destruction would set in motion something far more enduring for Australia. Within a year, nearly all of the miners' demands, fair taxation, voters' rights, representation, would be obtained. The Eureka Rebellion and the American Revolution were both uprisings against perceived injustices imposed by distant or unresponsive governments. The scale, the stakes, the aftermath is a little different. Both begin with grievances over taxation without representation. In colonial America, it's the British levying those duties on us on paper, tea, other goods without consent, also enforcing smuggling. In fact, the enforcement was worse than the tax. I almost get the sense the whole revolution could have been solved if there was some light tax applied, or if the British were able to take some smaller amount. But the heavy enforcement on smuggling, and then other things like the Proclamation line, the Iron Act, and limits to manufacturing and limits to settlement, really were containing the future for American colonists and not making them feel free. All of those things. In this case, in Victorian Australia, the British colonial government imposed a flat mining license fee on all diggers, regardless of success, and enforced heavy-handed policing and little recourse. Protests escalated after petitions, negotiations fail, and in that way you see a similarity. But the American Revolution was an 8-year war, and it ends with independence. The Eureka Rebellion is over in 20 minutes, and it's brief and bloody, but both events prompt reform. Within a year, in Australia, the mining license was replaced by a more affordable miner's right, which granted voting privileges. Property qualifications for the Legislative Assembly membership were abolished, and manhood suffrage became law for the basic Legislative Assembly chamber. The American Revolution was leading to a new country. The Eureka Rebellion was not aimed at that purpose. Even the rebel leader insisted the movement was not disloyal to the crown. Although, if you remember in our American history, by comparison, many initially said that. Folks like your Dickinsons or your Galloways were saying that initially. We have no problem with the king himself, just with Parliament. Well, the king was solidly behind his Parliament, as it would turn out. But this is a different context. It's symbolic. It's true. In fact, Mark Twain visits Ballarat in the 1890s and compares Eureka to Lexington and Concord, a strike for liberty, a struggle for principle. And today there's a museum there. It's central to Australian history. After the smoke drifted away from the stockade and the campfires are doused, it gets worse. There's a martial law declared. There's some killings in the tents and the miners who weren't necessarily in the stockade. The goldfield really is a scary place for a little while. But news of those killings travel fast, and in Melbourne, crowds gather in the streets. Sympathy for diggers had surged, not just among radicals, but among everyone. It's shopkeepers, workers, landowners even. 13 prisoners were charged with high treason and paraded before courts in shackles. But inside packed courtrooms, one by one, Australian juries refused to convict. The final defendant is acquitted, to thunderous applause. The crowds lift them on their shoulders and march through the city in celebration. Faced with this public outrage and the threat, the Royal Commission into the Goldfield grievances is appointed within weeks. And you have those reforms that we talked about. Australia's European settlement had began in 1788. The British government established a penal colony at Sydney Cove in New South Wales. And the first fleet, carrying about 1,400 people, many of them convicts, arrived to establish a new outpost after Britain lost its American colonies. Between the time of this date and this Eureka Rebellion, about 150,000 convicts are transported from Britain and Ireland to Australia. A lot of times these are for petty crimes, things that might not be crimes today or in America at the time. Along with them came soldiers, government officials, and gradually free settlers as well. While colonies are dominated by their penal function, free migration began as early as the 1790s, and it expands steadily. Large numbers of free immigrants come in the 1830s and 1840s, and the gold rushes of the 1850s, especially in Victoria, transform the population, drawing tens of thousands, not only from Britain, but even from the United States and China, other countries in Europe. So 2 little stories I wanted to put on your radar, and that's it. I thank you for listening. And remember, we have a Patreon. There's a lot more little stories kind of like this. www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com to join that. Here's what I like about our sponsor, All the Hacks Podcast. You hear all these business podcasts, and they're all telling you to do things. Start a business, buy a home, write this off, write that off. All the Hacks is a podcast that acknowledges that things are kind of expensive right now. So All the Hacks focuses on tips and tactics to upgrade your life, your money, your travel, while spending less. It's about hacks, money. There's an episode about what each generation gets right and wrong with Ben Carlson, no relation. Some of us in Gen Z or boomers can learn from millennials and Gen Z. It doesn't just go one way. I like his bonus episode about earning points on your mortgage or cards that have up to 4% bonus programs. All great. Search for All the Hacks. That's All the Hacks in your podcast app. Hit follow and start upgrading your life today.